So we're in chapter 15, your last section, which is section 6, talking about ecological succession and man's role, going on from primary succession, secondary succession, man's dominion, and good stewardship. So primary and secondary succession. So let's go over what succession is. How does an ecosystem recover? Your book has a couple examples. So there was a volcanic eruption in 1980 where Mount St. Helens in Oregon transformed 150,000 acres of hemlock and Douglas fir into just totally barren land. Here's a picture of Mount St. Helens erupting. And then in 1988, there were great fires in Yellowstone Park that destroyed thousands and thousands of acres in Yellowstone Park. You can imagine. Recovery? How long is it going to take for these lands to recover? And how do they recover? And this is what we're going to talk about when we talk about succession, right? A variety of plant and animal species colonize the disturbed area and bring it back to life. So there's certain pioneer species that come in first, that after a whole area is practically destroyed, whether it's primary or secondary, you have these species that come and settle first, and these are called pioneer species, pioneer plants, pioneer animals. Pioneer species and ecological succession. So pioneer species are plants and animals that enrich the soil and prepare the way for other species to come in and repopulate the area. There's a series of changes that may take months or years, decades, or even centuries. But as they go, they're replanting and bringing in more types, more diversity of plants and animals. These changes are called ecological succession, the replacement of early pioneer species by later species in an orderly progression until it gets to its climax community. It gets to where it's not going to go into any more succession. It stops there. So the type of ecological succession is either primary or secondary, depending on how it started. So you see here, these are volcanic activity, and you see how these pioneer plants are coming in here, and when the volcanoes, and they're one of the first plants that come in, and they start growing in the midst of that, where the volcano, where the lava has turned into a rock, and you have these plants that could survive coming in and starting and replacing and replenishing the soil there for others to come later on. That's succession. So primary succession always starts with barren ground. So whenever you think of primary succession, it means after a volcano has erupted or in the sand dunes or something has happened, is it just totally barren ground. And so this is primary succession. Primary succession usually takes longer. A dramatic volcano erupted on the island of Krakatau in Indonesia in 1883. 1883, a long time ago. More than 35,000 people died from a great tsunami that was generated, and then the dust was thrown into the atmosphere and clouded the atmosphere for 10% of the sunlight in Europe for 3 years. So in Europe, they basically had this dust for 3 years from this great eruption. So you can imagine how long that would take. So before we get into that, I'm going to tell you how long it all took. Let's look at how, I don't know why I put this here, but you can see where the exposed lichens and the grasses come, and then the mixed herbaceous plants, shrubs, come into the young forest, and then the mature forest, and then onto the climax forest where they'll be. So this is succession is more secondary than primary, so I probably shouldn't put it on this slide, but you can see how, and then each step takes some time, as it gets back to normal. Krakatau. Let's talk about the Krakatau volcano. So here's the volcano, how a volcano going up at Krakatau, and here is what it looks presently. So there's no trace of plant or animal life has remained on the island at all. It kills the volcano, the eruption kills everything. Then 2 years later, takes 2 years later, comes in the blue-green algae, and the scattered mosses and some ferns appear in 2 years. And then 13 years later, there were some scattered trees, a few trees with some wild sugar canes, just a few orchards that came in. This is how long? 13 years. 23 years later, grass and a few scattered trees covered the island, and there were some ants and mosquitoes and birds and some bats and lizards were present after 23 years. 37 years later, can you imagine? Trees occupied half of the island. And then 47 years later, a tropical forest reclaimed the land. So this Krakatoa volcano to get to this point, took 47 years. That's slow. This was primary succession because there was nothing. There was nothing there, and then gradually everything started coming back, taking a lot of time. Primary succession on a newly established volcanic island. Here's a picture of it. So basically you can see where the volcano has erupted, and now you have some primary algae and some primary plants coming in. When I say primary, they were pioneers, means first. Primary succession involves the gradual establishment of biological communities in an area that has not been occupied by life before. So it was totally devastated, no life, and then the life comes. And it takes a while, usually, for primary succession. So secondary succession. So let's talk about this. Well, secondary succession starts with ready soil and pioneer species. So in case you have like an abandoned field or you have a burned forest, but you still have secondary, you still have a few plants. Like when a forest burns, it doesn't burn the whole forest down usually. Parts of the forest still have some plants that are living. So you can see that. And so then this occurs more rapidly than primary succession because some organisms already inhabit the area. So because there's organisms already there and living things, it doesn't take as long because they start reproducing the ones that are left. But usually these are annual weeds and crabgrasses and horseweed and dandelions. So you have the first one, if everything burns down, the first ones, let me see if you can, let me go closer here so you can see this picture. I think it's important. Sorry here. So here we have, the annual weeds here, crabgrass. Then come the perennial weeds and grasses. So the perennial weeds and grasses displace the annual ones. So that means the annual ones just come once a year, and then you have those that are come in the seasons, and then you go on to the shrubs. So for 3 or 4 years, the broom sedge, perennial grass as the dominating species, and also scattered pine seedlings come here. So you have these little pine seedlings of little tiny pine trees. And then 5 to 8 years, the broom sedge will be replaced by pines. So here we come. There's some pine trees here. These are pines. This one right here. See these smaller ones, little pine trees. And then on to the oak and the hickory and the maple seedlings, and they'll begin to grow in the pine forest. And eventually the pines were replaced by these deciduous trees, which will constitute the climax forest, the end, the climax forest. So here we have the trees. This is what the forest would look like, before it burned down. And so it takes a while, up to like 8 years, starting with the annual weeds, perennials, shrubs, then on to the aspen, cherry, and the young pine forest, and then on to the beech and the maple. So that's the secondary succession. Ecology in the Bible. So here's a picture. I love this picture of this tree, like a tree of life growing out of the Bible. Although the Bible does not use the word ecology, it should be word there, sorry, ecology, it certainly is not silent on the subject. The use of animals and plants are in Genesis 9:2. The habitats of birds and animals are in Psalm 104. Wind currents and water cycles are in Ecclesiastics. And that man's use of trees for fuel and such is in Isaiah. So here, let me back up here. So, there we go. Man's dominion. There's a picture of Adam and Eve. I don't know for sure if they look that way, but man's dominion. So scripture declares that man has dominion over nature. The Bible says that man is, the leader over nature. And from the beginning, God placed that the earth and all living things under man's authority and commanded him to subdue and have dominion over them. Genesis 1:26 through 28. That man should have dominion and authority over all the earth. This means that mankind is to use God's living creation to meet his physical needs. So God actually put things on the earth for our physical needs. Human life depends on the use of creation's resources, both living and non-living. So we need these resources to live, and God gave them to us. Part of man's dominion includes the ability to modify some of the abiotic and biotic factors to meet man's needs. So God gave some living materials and non-living materials so that mankind would survive on earth. So examples of man controlling floods by damming up levees, controlling weeds in fields and gardens, and controlling harmful animals by hunting and building fences. These kind of things are important, and certain ecologists would say, no, man needs to stay out. No, God created earth and created the plants and the animals for mankind. Good stewardship, though, is very important. So here's the world in the midst, With man's dominion comes responsibility to exercise good stewardship, to take care of this earth, and to manage creation by balancing the wise use of natural resources and their conservation. So we need to know, we do need to be conservationists, right? This can be accomplished in many different ways. Conserving and managing. How do we do this? This picture is just all kind of the ecology of the earth here. So distinguishing renewable resources. What are renewable resources? Like soil and water and wood. You can renew those things. You can plant more trees, or you can actually get recycled water, or the soil. They regenerate quickly, and in regenerating quickly, we can use them up and then we can have them again. But non-renewable resources such as fossil fuels and minerals regenerate very slowly. So like coal and fuels and minerals, some of them don't regenerate at all. So we need to actually be careful about using them up, right? Replanting trees and other vegetation to continue the carbon-oxygen cycle and supply the first link in the food chains. So when we destroy a forest, we need to replant a forest, right? And properly managing ecosystems to provide food for man as well for plants and animals. So we have to make sure that we have our ecosystem so that not only are we taking care of the plants, but we're also taking care of the animals. Wisely using biotechnology to produce higher yield crops and medicines, such as insulin, is important. So we do need, in the midst of all this, to plant those areas, to farm the land. In fact, God told man to go and farm the land. Reducing unnecessary consumption of resources and reusing and recycling resources. So we need to recycle things, is very important, and we need to not just consume things like they did the buffalo. They just went off to get the buffalo hides and left the whole buffalo, deteriorating on the prairies almost to extinction. That was terrible, terrible. It's not a good way of being a good steward of the land, that is for sure, and of animals. How our actions affect life. We must understand how our actions affect all life and must accept responsibility to manage nature wisely. This requires considering not only the short-term effects of human activity, but also the long-term effects. As we implement decisions, we must also monitor the environment to ensure that our actions have the desired effect. So we have to know, we always look, here's like a garbage dump here. So we have to look at the short-term effects of what something is going to do, that dump's going to do, and then the long-term effects of this, if this dump is in this area. Or just looking, because there's long-term effects to a pollution, isn't there? And there's short-term effects. So we need to look and see how can we manage the environment in these situations. So, and then we need to monitor the environment to look and see if what we're doing is making sense. Is what we're doing, is it right? Is it actually working? Unbiblical viewpoints. So there's a lot of unbiblical viewpoints when it comes to ecology, because one of the big unbiblical is climate change, but we're not going to get into that in this section. Stressing the welfare of nature above that of mankind. That's unbiblical. When you say, okay, nature is more important than man, so man must stay out. No, not biblical. Dismissing man's needs is unimportant. We don't care what man needs. We want to take care of the tree frog, or we want to take care of this type of owl, or we want to take care of this little algae, dismissing man's needs as unimportant is unbiblical. Example, some extremists object to harvesting trees for any reason. They'll say, we're protecting the tree, we're tree huggers. Yet God created the trees to provide people with lumber, furniture, paper, cooking, and heating, all these things that come from lumber, from trees. Forestry not only benefits mankind, but also benefits the ecosystems by thinning forests of disease. So when you have diseased forests, you cut them down so they would not transmit their diseases. Or dying trees. The dying trees are falling over, they're going to cause a fire, right? So these things, we need to make room for new growth. So forestry is important. Of course, cutting too many trees can be detrimental. We don't want to go in and just cut tons of trees down in certain areas. Not the thing to do. Especially a lot of trees provide oxygen to the air. So logging companies can replant in the forests where they harvest, and the trees will reproduce unless too many are harvested. So logging companies go in, and then when they do cut down the trees, they need to replant the trees. The most dangerous flaw. Okay, let's see what this is. The most dangerous flaw of the modern environmental movement is that it promotes a reverence for nature that belongs to God alone. We call this pantheism, when someone worships nature instead of God. The earth and all its life forms and processes are sacred. We belong to them and they are kin to us. So, no, we don't want to worship nature. We are to worship the Creator, not the creation. This is in Romans, actually, in the Bible. It says we need to worship the Creator. Do not worship the creation. God controls the world's ecosystem, but he expects man to study the creation, to share his concern for it, and to bring honor and glory to him through the practice of good stewardship. So the most dangerous flaw was if we worship nature and do not worship God. Here's a picture of Jesus. I like this last picture. It is my Father's desire that you receive my kingdom in its fullness. Don't you love that? That's the end of this chapter 15 on ecology. And now we're going to get into all of the animals that live on this planet Earth.